And this is already on? Okay. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome everyone to Ethics Awareness Week, and welcome today for our session on migrant crossings. I'm very excited to have you here, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Fukushima here. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Ezgi Sertler. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Humanities, and I also coordinate the Gender Studies program. So what we are going to do today, we thought that we will hear from Dr. Fukushima for about 20 minutes or so, or 15 to 20, and then I'm going to ask her some general questions about her research and her book, and we are then going to open the floor for Q&A and questions and answers. So that's going to be our structure. And now I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Isabel Fukushima is Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies, Director of Office of Undergraduate Research, and Associate Professor in the Division of Ethnic Studies with the School of Cultural and Social Transformation at University of Utah. She's the lead fellow for 2023 for the School of Cultural and Social Transformation Mellon-funded Transformative Intersectional Collective. In 2020 and 2021, she was a University of Utah Presidential Leadership Fellow. And prior to joining the faculty of University of Utah, Dr. Fukushima was an Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at Rutgers University with the Institute for Research on Women and the Department of Women and Gender Studies. She received her PhD from University of California, Berkeley, in ethnic studies with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. She is the co-lead for the Institute of Impossible Subjects project, Migratory Times. She's also the project lead and co-principal investigator for the Gender-Based Violence Consortium. And our topic for our discussion today, she's the author of the award-winning book, Migrant Crossings, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the US. It was published in 2019, and it actually received the American Sociological Association Asia and Asian American Section Book Award. Migrant Crossings, the book that we'll be discussing today, and research in general, examines the experiences and representations of Asian and Latino migrants trafficked in the United States into informal economies and service industries through socio-legal and media analysis of court records, press releases, law enforcement campaigns, film representations, theater performances, and the law. Dr. Fukushima questions how we understand victimhood, criminality, citizenship, and legality. And with that being said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fukushima to our campus.
All right, well, thank you everyone for having me here. I'm super excited to be with you all. A very short drive from the University of Utah. I want to just say very briefly, I'm very appreciative to Brian and Ezgi for inviting me and organizing this, as well as the many folks that have organized this event. And all of you for joining this. I think we have some folks who are joining online as well. So thank you folks for joining us. Today I'm here to talk about and share with you my work called Migrant Crossings, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the United States. This project really was framed and inspired by my own community work and partnerships of thinking about witnessing. And I'll talk a little bit about this theory of witnessing in a bit. But some of the questions that drove the project was, who is seen as a trafficked person, and how does a trafficked person cross into visibility? I did a range of theoretical and analytical frameworks, as well as more of a hemispheric approach of looking at Asia-Pacific in relation to Latinidad and the Americas. But here today, I want to think with you all about witnessing. And it just might help you in case if you didn't read the book or have a chance to pick it up, if I just offer a little bit of an excerpt. In 2017, I was called upon by a local organization in California to examine cases of youth who had been trafficked into the United States. The goal was to examine the cases for human trafficking and provide expert reports to supplement their cases for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, and asylum officers. Some of the youth's cases went back as far as 2014 and involved children from south of the U.S. border, migrating across the U.S.-Mexican border from countries like Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala, being treated as criminals and therefore deportable. Debate surrounding expedited removal circulated in spite of story upon story of persecution, violence, and human trafficking. The youth cases spoke to dominant ideologies and misplaced anxiety surrounding the stereotypes of the, quote, hordes, end quote, of migrants entering the United States, in spite of the trend showing that migration from countries like Mexico was at a net zero. As migrant children and their families attempted to enter the United States through the border, policymakers were quick to criminalize the migrants, alleging visa fraud for the trafficking visa. Anti-traffickers and policymakers debated the misperceptions of the visibility of migrant children, exposing the gaps in U.S. immigration policy and practice. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees found that based on 400 interviews, 48% of the children crossing the U.S.-Mexican border experienced violence or threats by organized crime groups, and 22% experienced violence in the home or by their caretakers. In spite of the perception of, quote, illegal, end quote, migration, victim witnesses, survivors of border violence from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, told a more complex story. While headlines focused on migrant children who were released to traffickers, others, like Saul from Honduras, illuminated experiences of being trafficked as they made their way to the United States. Saul's story is found in a statement released by the Freedom Network USA in August 2014, a response to the discourse surrounding undocumented children. Saul's story is as follows. Saul grew up in a gang-infested neighborhood in Honduras. For several years, the local gang tried to forcibly recruit Saul. They beat him, threw battery acid on him, and threatened to kill him. One day, when Saul was walking with a female friend, the gang attacked them. Gang members beat Saul and raped his friend. Saul knew that if he did not join the gang, they would kill him. Saul begged his mother, who was in the United States, to send for him since there was nowhere safe for him in Honduras. When Saul was 15 years old, his mother finally was able to arrange for a man to bring him to the United States. However, before reaching the border, Saul was captured and trafficked in Mexico by armed men. His traffickers took him to a hotel room where he was kept for a couple of weeks. Saul's traffickers then forced him to carry a backpack with drugs across the border. Threatened with his life, Saul had no choice but to smuggle the backpack across the border for his traffickers. Saul was finally able to escape traffickers when they were apprehended by CBP, Custom Border Patrol in Texas. And so in general, Saul's story is one of what we would say is a successful identification of human trafficking. He was someone that was seen as visible as a trafficked person. Later on in the introduction, I talk about another case of Rigoberto Laie, who actually was an example who had the same fact patterns, but unlike Saul, he was not seen as a person who was trafficked. In fact, was seen as criminalized and deportable. These are the kinds of tensions that I'm thinking through in my work when I talk about witnessing the experiences of those who migrate to the United States and the dualities that they're bound to of victim and criminal. And in my work, I'm thinking through this notion of a witness as a person who's called to action or inaction. We are oftentimes spectators watching on television at a distance events unfold before us. And what distinguishes for me the concept of witnessing, thinking with Dory Laub and Kathy Caruth, is the way that witnessing is about action. What are the actions or inactions that we are called to? And in my work, I started to think about, though, however, the tensions around how we are called to particular kinds of actions, and that there was a need to unsettle the way that we are witnessing as a collective, where it's not just about the individuals who witness events that people experience or their own self as witness, but we need to actually unsettle witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing, raise questions about normative aspects of events, paying attention to performances in institutions, and examining the politics of representation. So in my book, I'm thinking through tons of these kinds of concepts, and we won't have a ton of time to really get into the details of how there are things that are known and unknown, and the push-pull factors of immigration, and that there's actually, when I'm using the term human trafficking, it is distinguished from that of human smuggling, where human smuggling is a crime against a border and human trafficking is a crime against a person. I'm going to just give some high note highlights because I don't want to assume you've had a chance to read my book, although you're welcome to check it out. Many of the chapters are actually accessible online. You can find most of it for free in different places. But I wanted to actually think with you all about the case of United States versus Dan that happened in 2010 as an exemplar of another case that I was thinking with. Here it is an example of a domestic worker who was brought to the United States through legal means in which she entered in with a visitor visa and then overstayed her visa. Oftentimes when we think of immigrant communities, we assume that they are undocumented or without papers, but in fact, most of the immigration that happens to the United States is through legal means, in which people legally enter but may overstay or their visa status is no longer available to them. In the case of United States versus Dan, of a domestic worker who was trafficked into servitude in California, there were multiple witnesses in this particular case. There was an organization that was a respondent. Here she says, the organization SAGE helped me with the basic things, morally, doctor, food, clothes, because that was the most important thing right then. There was also her as a self-witness. The person I call Liliana, who was in the case, who took trial in a civil case against her trafficker, was a self-witness. She testified in the courts. There was also the community, the reader who reads a chapter, as well as a scholar participating in it. So for me, when I think about the concept of witnessing, there are multiple witnesses. In this particular case, what we saw was a very complex dynamics in a transnational case where Liliana was brought from Peru to the United States. She is Quechua, so an indigenous Peruvian. Her trafficker was also from Peru, but an upper-class Limeña. So there was class as well as racial dynamics that differed between them, even though one could say that the gender dynamics were similar, in which they both identified as women. Liliana came to the United States with the promises to learn English, how to drive, and pay, which were all essential for her to work in her local economy in Peru. But in this particular case, I think through it because one of the things that I was thinking about was how, I don't know if you've all heard about how do you cook a frog, that kind of phrase, how do you cook a frog? It's a very common phrase that people would use about in domestic violence cases as well, in which they say, if you haven't heard it, so just to share with you if you don't cook frog, is how do you cook a frog is that they say if you put it in a hot pot, the frog will jump out. But if you put it in a cool pot and you raise the heat slowly over time, you'll have a cooked frog. And in this particular case of Liliana, that is the same description that they used to describe her, the prosecutor used to describe Liliana as that of like a cooked frog over time. Because in her particular case, there was no physical altercations except for one moment between her and her trafficker. For the most part, she was unpaid. But what her trafficker would do is she would show her newspaper clippings of what the United States does to immigrants here. She would show her them the newspaper clippings and say, this is what they do to immigrants like you. And it was like stories about, deportations. And she would tell her that she was safer with her and that if she left her trafficker, then that would happen to her. And so Liliana was compelled to stay in her trafficking conditions. And in this particular case of a civil case, it actually ended up becoming a successful human trafficking case in the civil courts. And though while the prosecutor, Andy Wong, you referred to her as a cooked frog, I actually saw her as an anti-frog because she left the pot, right? She was in there, but she left. Some of the things that come up in human trafficking that is really common is a narrative around a passport. You'll oftentimes hear the question as, has somebody taken your passport? In the case of Liliana, a domestic worker who was trafficked into California in domestic work, her passport was taken from her. Her trafficker withheld it. And I've seen many cases in which documentation is withheld. For Liliana, she did believe that without her passport, she was not able to freely move around. And so that was one of the things when she left her abusive conditions that she really wanted to get back. So she stayed in it. I've written about passports withheld, and some of you may be wondering, I talk about T and U visas and S visas, and for those who may not be familiar, in the United States, after the passage of the 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, there were other laws that allowed us to actually provide temporary immigration relief to those who are experiencing a violent crime in the United States. A T visa is oftentimes used for people who are trafficked. A U visa is for those who've experienced a violent crime, so it could include domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. An S visa is for a person who has witnessed a crime and legal permanent resident status. And when you hear all these visas, you may be thinking, wow, those are really wonderful resources. But what we know about the standards, they're super high and very difficult to get, and oftentimes have many years of waiting for a person to get their status so they can simply work in the United States. So one of the things that I just wanted to highlight about Liliana in her particular case is that when she first went and spoke with the prosecutor about what she was experiencing, some of the things, at first the prosecutor did not want to take her case on because he actually didn't know if she really was trafficked. But there was this one moment where Liliana was telling the story where her trafficker would have her walk the children to school. And so she actually was not like how you would imagine it, chained in a basement or something along those lines. But she would walk the children to school, and her trafficker told her that she was not allowed to communicate with other people in the community. She was not allowed to talk to them. So she would walk the children to school and then go back home, wait for them, pick them up, and bring them back home, cook, clean, and all the services that were needed in the household. And there was this radio that Liliana had that she would listen to Spanish radio, and it was the only connection she had to the outside world because she'd been told by her trafficker her communications were controlled, that she was not allowed to talk to anybody else. She got into a verbal argument with her trafficker, and the trafficker took the radio and broke it. And that was actually the only moment in the interviews that Liliana actually cried, was when she was describing about the breaking of the radio, this last connection of communication to the outside world, to her community. And so when I think about tears, and I just highlight this in this particular chapter, and I think about it a lot in my work, is that when we think about who is a victim and how people experience violence, we oftentimes think of the person who's crying or visibly falling apart, but actually people survive trauma in so many different ways. It shows up in our bodies in different ways. And so I have literally interviewed people who smiled as they talked about horrific things that they were experiencing, laughed uncomfortably, or showed no expression at all. And so to assume that one who's experiencing a violence would embody it in a certain way through tears is simply not true. And so it's just, those were some of the things I was thinking with through even a specific exemplar of Liliana, and how her case was in its entirety translated in the courts. So we would see her interpreter performing her translation. As she was speaking, his voice would raise up. He was doing his own performance as well in the court hearings in that particular case. So much of her story was narrated through translation, which we can talk a little bit about that. But as a last final note, before we have a conversation with Ezgi and myself and then open it up to you all, is that I did want to highlight that some of the things that were also really important in this particular case that we see oftentimes happening for people who are working in low wage or in conditions that are abusive is the role of food. And so some of the things that I have written about as well as food, the matrix of food insecurity. And in the particular case of Liliana, this case, there was this one moment where she would walk the children to school and she was being food deprived. Her trafficker was weighing her food, so controlling the amount she could eat, because that was the amount that they were willing to pay for her to eat. So she was losing weight, she was not able to have food. And so what she would do when she would walk the children to school is there was a gardener who had fruit trees, another Latino who worked in the garden, and there were fruits. She would pick fruits from the tree and eat that as part of her sustenance. And over time, her teeth started to rot as well because of the high acidity in her diet. And that really stuck with me about this thing about food access, that when we think about the basic needs that one has to live, to be a full human, immigration relief for the migrant worker, for the person who comes to the United States, is one of the many things that they need to be a full human, including food, housing, a safe place to, sleep. Liliana oftentimes, and people like her in her conditions, oftentimes are forced to sleep on the floor or in unlivable conditions. And so this is a case I share with you all, and I think that one of the things that I'm going to, I'm not going to go through all my slides. I tend to be an over-preparer. And so I am going to conclude because I think we oftentimes have the question about the trafficker, and then I'll go and sit and join with you, Ezgi. But I'm going to read the conclusion from the chapter 4 where I talk about the case of Liliana. In examining Liliana and Dan's legal case as a witness interrogating witnessing, I'm left with the recognition of my own limits of witnessing and the process of witnessing in general. However, to examine witnessing and homosocial violence has multiple interventions in anti-trafficking discourse, feminist theory, and practice. What it means to witness cannot be taken for granted or naturalized. What is at stake for feminism's theories and decolonization and transnational framings is that to move beyond victim criminal paradigms is to interrogate the mode of witnessing in itself and call for a new form of witnessing, an unsettled witnessing. As Liliana's story is made visible and legible to those who witnessed her story in the legal system and in the media, an unsettled witnessing informed by decolonial practice begins with recognizing the boundaries of witnessing within colonial structures. In the anti-trafficking narrative, how Liliana matters is always and only in relation to her experience of human trafficking. Liliana's history in Cusco, her transnational relationship with her boyfriend, her family, whom she sent remittances, and her life in the United States, as well as other aspects of one's life that illustrate the complex humanity that one inhabits, are absent in the media, suggesting that what mattered was how Liliana was exploited, not how she lives. To close, I end with a Dan who never speaks. Therefore, what was witnessed was her silence and mediation through other actors. Dan is an immigrant, a Limeña Peruvian. So Dan is the trafficker, just to remind folks. A mother of 3 children, a divorcee, a former real estate agent, a Berkeley alumna, a now convicted felon who served time in jail. Dan's story is always mediated through other actors, through the U.S. Attorney, the public defender, and the witnesses who took to the stand, such as Liliana, a Homeland Security agent, an interviewer for U.S. Embassy, a senior security representative for American Airlines, officers of Walnut Police Department, a computer forensic agent, parents from the school her children attended, the head custodian at the school, a gardener, the gardener's employer, and I list other folks here too. Dan's ex-boyfriend, her brother, and her brother's girlfriend. The courts never heard Dan's narration of her own story, even though witnesses describe moments of choice, even at the moment of arrest. Prior to her arrest, Dan requested to be taken to the hospital to have a medical checkup. Although she was arrested, it was on her terms, albeit limited. Similar to Liliana, Dan is always represented through other witnesses. But in contrast to Liliana, Dan never takes a stand. In a way, although problematic, how the media describe Dan best illuminates how she is witnessed. Quote, on Monday, Dan saw KTVU's camera and covered her face with what appeared to be a ski mask and goggles as she took her children to school, end quote. A person attempting to live a life beyond the eye of the public, she was always in it and interpreted by it, covered yet on display. And so these are some of the things that in my work I think about. I'm excited for a conversation with you all to think through the complexities when we this is a week on ethics awareness that I think is really important for us to think of the multiple ways we can frame how we understand ethics, both from our own positionality as well as the subjects that we take up. And for me in today's presentation, I'm thinking about my work of migrants and violence. And so I'm going to join Ezgi. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of excerpts from my work.
Is this okay? Closer? A little bit closer?
Yeah,
okay.
Brian said you have to eat the mic. That's what Brian said earlier. Sorry, charge.
I'm actually going to hold it. I think that's better. Okay, thank you so much again.
Yeah.
It was great to read your work and also have this conversation with you today. So I have prepared some general questions about human trafficking and migration that I'm going to be asking. But while I do that, feel free to make note of your own questions since we're going to have the last part of our session focused on Q&A with the audience.
Yes, I'm going to listen. I'm just going to do this. Sorry. In case folks
Go ahead. Also, I wanted to remind everyone that if you're actually interested in reading Dr. Fukushima's work, we have asked our library, Fulton Library, to have to buy the book for our students. So you do actually have access to electronic copy if you search the book. You should be able to read any chapter you want. Keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to actually start with a very general question. What are some issues, problems, concerns with the way in which we understand, and by we I mean just locally, nationally, or internationally, the way we understand human trafficking today?
Yeah, human trafficking is a very new phenomenon as far as when we think about national responses. It was not until 2000 in the United States that it was legislated to have an actual legal response to human trafficking. Before that, when we trace back to other legal moments from the 1910 Mann Act, going further back to abolition of slavery, these had very different specific historical kind of things that they were responding to. For the 1910 Mann Act, it was responding to single women traveling across borders with the assumption that they were participating in sexual economies. And we're all familiar with slavery in the United States. But human trafficking is a very complex legal understanding. If I were to have any of you seen the definition of human trafficking, like really spelled out, it literally is a very long paragraph where it says human trafficking is about the recruiting, harboring, transporting, obtaining a person for the purpose through their force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of their debt, bondage, sex, or labor. It's a very long kind of definition. And in the anti-trafficking world, in the legal sense, what we see is that there is a focus on force, fraud, and coercion as central facets to what makes human trafficking. And so to go to the question about like what are some of the things that, when we think about the everyday person, is that we don't think about things in complexities. Most people in their everyday are thinking about understanding this is bad and this is good, right? And that's how we respond to things. And it's actually human trafficking is very complicated. I would say there's no one that is for human trafficking. But how to tackle the issues actually requires a multifaceted approach. It's an immigration question. It is a question around food, access, housing. It's a question around labor rights. And so forth. The list goes on depending on who we're thinking and understanding gets trafficked. I know that in the United States there was a shift towards focusing on U.S. citizens who are trafficked. And then if you looked at the kind of discourse that went hand in hand with that, it oftentimes focused on white girls who were being trafficked into sexual economies. And that kind of, I think, suggested our own anxieties as a society, which is the innocence loss of white girls in the U.S. And so, it's a complicated issue. Yes, white girls are trafficked, but so too are black, brown children, and a range of bodies that make it a very complicated issue to respond to in general. And so, I would say in the United States, we have a very, in movements, we take a more simple approach. And we want the simple approach. We want solutions. We want to be told that there is a simple answer to change this thing, when in fact, in thinking around issues of human trafficking, our response that we need is complicated.
Thank you. Actually, the next question is a little bit related to that, because you mentioned in your book that a lot of people use the term modern-day slavery. Mm-hmm. For human trafficking. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about what you think about that term, what we should think about that analogy, and what are some advantages and disadvantages of using that term in particular.
So modern-day slavery is a popular way to describe human trafficking, and it's a term that I don't use, but I disentangle in my book. And the reason why it's complicated is because when we think about what is slavery, that happened, antebellum slavery, we're all very familiar. The African slave trade that brought people from Africa to the U.S. To work as non-humans, people who were denied the access to be seen as people, right? They were denied the rights to have rights. And so slavery is a very specific term that signals a moment in the United States history around the Black experience. And when we add on the term modern day slavery, I think people oftentimes think this is suggesting a contemporary nod. But the fact is that that slavery that happened in the United States was during our modern period, right? We are existing in modernity. And so it is actually not outside of it or even pre it. And so when I think of this term modern slavery, and some of the critiques of this concept have been because it oftentimes erases the Black experience when we talk about modern day slavery. And so that's been some of the debates around those terms. I think that more specificity in our terms is useful, but then also recognizing, I think we have generosity with each other, and we recognize that we slip between terms, and that people might use terms in shorthand ways that are easier for them to understand the concept.
Thank you so much. I did not turn it on. Okay, so the next question is actually about these two terms that keep coming up, human trafficking and migration. Mm-hmm. And for those of us who are not familiar or who are not familiar with either of those, I wanted Dr. Fukushima to talk a little bit about what is the relationship between. Do people usually, when we hear human trafficking, do we think about migration necessarily? When we hear migration, sometimes it might be the case that people don't put these two words together at all. So how do you generally think about the relationship between these two terms and these two phenomena?
Yeah, migration is about people's ability to move where they reside, and actually many of us in this room might be, internal migrants, right? I'm not from Utah, I grew up in Hawaii, right? I myself am a migratory person who's moved from one place to another. And so when we think about migration in a global context, there is the boundary crossing of nation states, though, that oftentimes I think people think about when they think of immigration as one crossing a national border. And in the United States, we have a very complex immigration history that when we look at our complex immigration history, we can trace different laws that show a legal mapping of who was allowed entry and citizenship over time, starting with Chinese exclusion acts, as well as thinking about 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act and so forth. There's a lot of immigration policies that have impacted movement and people's ability to be seen as citizens. So immigrants are migratory and can be people who have citizenship status at some point, legal permanent residents, or on a path towards it, visa holders. The citizen is a different person. They are oftentimes a person who has the full ultimate rights to have rights under a country, right? But for human trafficking, when I think about what is human trafficking in relation to immigration, is that not all trafficked people are immigrants and not all immigrants are trafficked. But there is a deep intersection between human trafficking and immigration when we think about the systems that are in place that allow people to be full humans. Trafficked people oftentimes do not have access to the full rights of labor rights that a citizen would have, as well as when we think about the insecurities that they have around food and all of that. And so, yeah, there's an intersection between immigration and trafficking, but I would say that not all trafficked people are immigrants and not all immigrants are trafficked people. But it's important for us to think about it in that intersection.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. The next question is something that I find myself thinking about in the context of the asylum system and migration as well. And you mentioned this a little bit during your presentation. But we usually, both within the migration system and within the legal system around it, we see victimhood and criminality kind of juxtaposed against each other, I guess. And so I wanted to hear you say a little bit more about how we hear like the victimhood and criminality together within the legal system in particular, and also in relation to that, the idea of the perfect victim and how that figures into both, I think, asylum courts and also, as I understand from your work, human trafficking cases as well.
Yeah, so I was really intrigued by The Perfect Victim when I was doing, so my book is informed by not only research, but also my own participation in the movement where I worked as a case manager, an advocate, programs coordinator. I worked at all levels of organization. And I think that one of the things when we talk about, I would hear from different folks like, oh, so-and-so was the perfect victim. And what they were saying in the legal sense was that this person, there was no controversy about them being able to have access to legal relief. And we would see and hear this all the time around immigrants and migrant communities, is whether or not they were the perfect victim. And the challenge with that is that when you're not the perfect victim, the person who is seen as on a path to citizenship, is clearly not controversial in your case, then you are then more likely than not to be seen as somebody who is a criminal. And we would see this time and time again, especially in the opening case that I talk about with Saul, with people who are participating in informal economies like drug sales or forced human smuggling or forced arms sales. We would see these kinds of complexities is that when people were compelled to participate in criminalized activities, if they could not prove their victimhood, they were seen as criminalized and deportable. And we saw this time and time again, and we still see this today. And in fact, I think that that is part of the kind of duality that we oftentimes, when we look to our migrant communities who are crossing and entering the United States, these kind of tensions around victim and criminal keeps coming up time and time again. But if we keep to uphold that some people are victims and some are criminal, then what that means that when you are a criminalized person is that you may not have the rights to have the same kinds of rights. And what we have seen is that in human trafficking cases is that oftentimes, and even in the case of Liliana, they are forced to participate in criminalized activities. Liliana participated in visa fraud to enter the United States, as was compelled by her trafficker. Even though what was interesting about her, because the case was a winning case and was a first case to have a civil success in Northern California, even the prosecutors and Immigration Customs Enforcement would refer to her as the perfect victim. But I remember there was a time in the beginning where they weren't sure if she was the perfect victim as well.
Thank you. You already mentioned this, so I'm actually going to ask that question right now. So in the book, you also mentioned that you worked at multiple levels of organizations. I'm actually going to read from here. As a volunteer, as a case manager for trafficking survivors, as programs coordinator for anti-trafficking and anti-violence initiatives, as a technical assistant provider to the Office for Victims of Crime-funded organizations, as an expert witness on human trafficking cases, as a consultant for organizations, as an expert on immigration cases for the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS for short, and in other various leadership roles at a number of organizations. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how that kind of work and how that part of your work has influenced your academic work, and how do you see the relationship between those two?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was, so if you can imagine, when I was doing a lot of the case management work, I was a doctoral student. I was a full-time student at UC Berkeley. I was also teaching at the time, and so I was like juggling many things. And I don't know if any of you have lived in California, but it's very expensive, right? It's very expensive. So I was doing it for survival reasons, but I think that one of the things that I was also doing it for, though, was that for me, I could not, I think, as far as my own commitments, do the kind of writing and thinking that I felt was important if I myself was not rolling my sleeves up and participating in the communities that I was writing about. And so doing the work alongside communities has been really important for me. I still work and collaborate with organizations now that as part of my practice. And so there's a term that I like to use, which is praxis, the practice of theory. And I think that oftentimes when people think of intellectuals, they think of us in a building, doing our work somewhere else. But the fact is that our work has impact, whether it is circulating and students are reading it and shaping their lives. It is also informed by communities. And so the theory of witnessing was very much informed by the communities that I worked with, because it was informed by the tension I was experiencing and seeing them experience as I was doing the work.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have 2 questions left, I think. I think we're doing well. The first one is actually, this also has come up in your book a couple of times, how migrants today in particular experience welcome and rejection at the same time. So I also wanted to invite you to tell us a bit more about that. What does it mean to experience welcome and rejection as a community?
I mean, we can look at our own community here in Utah. Is that I would say that Utah would say it's very welcoming to the immigrant community. We have a resettlement services for those who are refugee. We also, you might find it that kind of language of welcome on different governor and different websites that are government based. But the rejection side then that goes hand in hand with that we'll see is like operations that are intended to find immigrants who are undocumented and deport them. So you'll see that kind of tension of welcome and rejection happening here, even in our local context. And it's actually national, right? This is not unique to Utah. Utah is not a special case. It's happening in states across the United States, even those that would say that they are the most liberal of environments like California. And so this kind of welcome and rejection, I think, is common in the United States. It goes back to, I think, the formation of who we are, of nation making. When we think about who was included to have citizenship, as well, like over time we see that shifting. So that's how I'm thinking of welcome and rejection.
Yeah, thank you. And that actually makes me think about, I think there was a lot of sort of news articles around refugees welcome, especially after Germany's decision to welcome a particular, number of them. And a lot of people after that started writing what comes after the welcome, right?
Yes.
Okay, that was good, but what comes after that? And that was also an interesting exchange to see. Okay, I'm going to end with actually witnessing that you talked about, a theory of witnessing that you're developing in your book. And in line with our Awareness Week today, you do sometimes use the word ethical witnessing. So how are you thinking about what it means to ethically witness something?
Yeah, so, when I was thinking about witnessing, and unsettled witnessing, I think was an endeavor to kind of think about our own subject position when we are participating in witnessing and troubling that it is not innocent, that none of us, when we are witnessing events, are innocently just watching something happen. It's shaped by power dynamics, our ability to do or not do something. And so, for example, I think that's kind of the stuff that I'm thinking about. I think a lot with decolonial feminist theorist Maria Lugones, who actually talks about her own concept of faithful witnessing, which is to witness on the side of the oppressed. And she's a philosopher, and she has very much shaped the way that I think about the concept of witnessing when we think about who we are witnessing on the side of. And so witnessing on the side of the oppressed is a very complex dynamic, and it's moving, and who is oppressed and not oppressed is not a binary. It is not like you are always in that subject location. I am a professor, right? I'm in a position of a power compared to many communities. And so to also deeply think about my own positionality when I was doing the work, also to think about when I was a case manager working on the front lines, that while I was working hard on the front lines, I too was in a position of power, being able to define who was seen as a trafficked person or not, from the moment we did an intake to the moment that we reported it to a lawyer and so forth. And so there's a lot of power in how people participate in witnessing mechanisms, and I think it is to really interrogate that, are we asking the questions that we need to ask to think about something, to understand a person's story, or are we asking the questions that do not open up where there are things that they might want to share? When you ask people questions about their immigration experience, there are different things that will that they want to focus on, because it depends on their journey to the United States. And so just even asking a person about that experience, those responses are so varied. And so, that's how I've been thinking a lot about witnessing, about even troubling that, like, I'm not an innocent witness here, that I have power in the way that I participate in these mechanisms, as do you in the room.
thank you so much, Dr. Fukushima, for this great conversation and for answering these questions. Okay, before we open the floor up for Q&A, I do want to remind the QR codes. So for those of you who are in the room, you will see the QR codes on the walls of this room, and you could actually take a survey, right? I'm saying that right? Okay, you could take a survey to let us know how Ethics Awareness Week was for you. And also, for those of you who are tuning in online, a link of the survey will be sent to you via chat. Okay, so without further ado, questions from the audience.
So the question was, if for the online folks, is that, do I think that human trafficking would go down if we opened our borders? That's a really great question. I think that we would like to say yes. Some people would like to say yes, but what we have seen that actually in some cases, including like countries like Amsterdam, it didn't go down. It very much is dependent on multiple things happening. When we talk about people's ability to move across borders, is that there has to be other things, like, is it easy for them to access labor and job opportunities? Right now, when we look at our contract labor system, using the example of workers who work in our agriculture industry on temporary visas, is that they are beholden to working for their specific employer. So even if they could move freely across the border, or that was shifted, the question comes up for me around the terms of labor, as well as the terms of like how people are able to access housing. So I don't know if that would really change. I mean, what we see here happening in Utah as well, in our area, is that the cost of housing is going up. It's very expensive for people to live. And when it's expensive for you to live and you're not able to afford your rent, not able to find a job even, then that's where we start to see people surviving in economies, and that's where traffickers take advantage of the opportunity to have somebody work in conditions that they would have not otherwise wanted or consented to, right? And so I think it's a complicated one, is that I am in support of, free movement. I also recognize that it is only one facet of a complex thing that's happening, where it won't solve our trafficking conditions. Give you another example. What I've seen in my work, and I looked at homosocial cases, so when women trafficked women in my book, but the other thing that we know is that you're more likely to know your trafficker than you are not. And so that means that there is a lot of familial violence that is happening. And so if you are more likely to be trafficked by a family friend, a family member, then even if we are able to move freely, then the question becomes, what are happening in the conditions of our families that are leading people to exploit the people that they supposedly love? There is a lot of intersections between domestic violence and human trafficking that we see, especially in conditions where people survive in sexual economies. They are oftentimes a lover with the person that is trafficking them as well. And so, so that's a very big question. Thank you for asking it. It's like yes and no, right? Like, it would be nice, but maybe, but in order to future that, we'd also have to understand what's happening at present, which is there's so many things that are creating the conditions. That includes immigration or mobility access, as well as other things. Thank you. Don't be shy. I came all the way from University of Utah. Oh, fabulous. Love online questions.
The online question says, how can you develop being a faithful witness?
That's a great question. I think it's like any kind of practice that takes rigor and time. So when I think of my own practice, I would say that I'm still working on it, right? That we continue to work on the ways that we are able to participate in actions or witnessing communities. And that so I think it's an ongoing thing. I think that there are trainings that I do encourage folks to participate in. For me, it starts with educating ourselves. And so some of the things, when I started doing this work, is I got domestic violence certified. I participated in organizations to get trained. Just because we read about it doesn't mean we know about it. Right, and that I think it's really important for us to keep going through the conversations, listening, meeting with people, having conversations with people whose maybe point of view on issues are not those that reflect your own. And so I've had many kinds of conversations that have helped to shift how, even if I were to revisit myself 20 years ago doing the on-the-ground work in my younger self, is that I would say that my point of view has changed a lot. And part of it has to do with the ongoing conversations and with the willingness to shift, that willingness to recognize that we maybe don't always hold the same views that we've had for our entire lives, that it shifts too. So I think there's trainings, there's education, there is also recognizing that, one of the things that I used to see when I worked in a nonprofit in San Francisco that worked with people who had the intersection of substance use, sexual economies, and human trafficking, and immigrant communities as well were in part of that, is that I would see that oftentimes when we would get calls from communities is that people wanted to meet survivors of human trafficking. There was a real voyeurism that was happening. It's like they wanted to touch a survivor, right? Like they wanted to meet this person. But the reality is that survivors of human trafficking may be sitting in a class next to you. They may in fact be going to church with you as well if you have faith. There was a leader in the Bay Area, Oakland, Nola Brantley, who founded Missy, which worked with young folks in sexual economies, and particularly with folks of color in the Black community. And what she would do is she would connect with different churches, because she realized that actually a lot of these folks who were surviving in informalized economies were going to church. And so that's just to say that when we think about who we're connecting with, the communities that we're connecting with, it's not always something out there. It is actually very much a part of our own communities as well. And so the question is when people are suffering or experiencing things, what is our ability and capacity to have conversations, to be open and be that person for them? There was a case, and this is like super, I'm sorry, like all these cases coming to my head. There was one that happened, I remember in California, where it was a little boy who was forced into domestic servitude, and every day he would take out the trash to throw it away. And at night he would be, actually this was a cuffed case where he was actually chained in the basement, which rarely happens, but he in this case was. And when he would work and he would have free mobility, it would be to actually go and throw the trash away. And then his neighbor would see him, and every day she would say hello to him. And then he would go back inside and continue to live in his abusive conditions. In this particular case, when the little boy had a chance to run away, the first person he ran to was that neighbor who would say hello to him every day, because it was the only person that he recognized and felt like was kind to him. So I think that there is, and I'm not trying to be like, hippie about things, but it's actually really true. It's like, it goes a long way to even just be kind to people and the people that are our neighbors. And when we think about our communities, our migrant communities who are moving into our communities and are part of our communities, how kind are we to those people who may be experiencing suffering, that maybe if they needed to reach out, who would be the first person they would connect with? Other questions? Yeah.
Are there certain patterns or behaviors that you maybe pick on that maybe sort of point towards maybe this person is being trafficked or whatever? What are those patterns that you might pick up on?
Yeah, so you're talking about the patterns of a person who is trafficked. It's actually really interesting, because I remember they used to come out with different kinds of like handouts on that, right? And they would say, and you can even find them in the airport too, right? It would be like, oh, is this person like, do they look scared and timid? Do they not make eye contact? Cultural reasons, people may not make eye contact, right? It may actually be inappropriate. But they have things like that. I think it really depends on context. And so like, I remember when I was doing and still working on a study around child labor trafficking. So children who experience abuse in work conditions, both informalized and formalized, right? And so one of the things that we would see though, and hear from our different experts that we were connecting with, is that one of the things that they would notice is children not showing up for school. Because we always want to look for physical indicators of abuse. But as I said earlier, it shows up so different on our bodies that you actually literally could be somebody who is a high-performing person who looks normal and is experiencing abuse, and people would not know. We see that happen all the time. We survive violence very differently. But some of the things that they would see is like, for example, young folks not attending school or grades failing when one was normally performing high. But you could say that it could have just been something happening in their life, right? Was it trafficking? Is that trafficking? Or is that just maybe their parents are going through something, or they are going through something? So I think when it comes to kind of the narratives of like, it is or it isn't, I can say that there are things that are indicators, they call them indicators that experts might look for, but we can also trouble those indicators and say those are the very things that would not necessarily show a person is trafficked, from a person whose passport has been withheld, they are isolated or not allowed to communicate with others. Like, these are common things that are used as like indicators. And so I tend to go on the side of like, we shouldn't assume or want to look for trafficking. We should want to understand a person's life. And that trafficking narrative may come up in their stories or in their life, or how they share their lives with you. But I think the entry point is not looking for trafficking, but looking to understand a person. And so even when I've done interviews with people who've experienced trafficking, I do not start with the trafficking. I start with understanding their lives.
Other questions?
When we become aware through understanding of people's situations and find out that they have been trafficked, what's the course of action, and what resources do we have within like the valley here?
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Would you mind repeating again?
Yeah, so the question is that, okay, you get to know this person, you're a good neighbor, you're a good human, and you get to know this person and you find out they are trafficked. What do you do? In Utah, we have the Utah Trafficking's in-person task force. That's one avenue. There's also the Polaris Project, which is a national organization. They can connect you to national different networks. Another organization that I'm a part of is the Freedom Network USA. They host annual conferences on human trafficking, and they bring folks from government representation to nonprofits to legal representation and what have you, from all walks of life. And that's where you actually get a lot of experts who are working on a range of human trafficking, from U.S. Citizens to international issues, domestic labor issues around the whole agriculture industry. I mean, each industry is just so different, right? When we think about agriculture, domestic work, sexual economies, forced drug sales, like they're all so different. And so there are lots of experts that come to that national conference that happens every year, and that's also a good place. I do find that it's always useful to start with connecting folks to the organizations you may know. And if you learn that somebody is experiencing things, don't assume, give them a lot of resources, because you just don't know which one they will connect with. In the case of Liliana, who ended up being able to escape her abusive conditions, is that she actually, in her particular case, it was actually really interesting. Every day, I'm sorry, I didn't share this part of the story. I know these cases inside and out, and I forget parts that I didn't share. But she would actually, when she would walk the children to school and she would drop them off, there was a school teacher who actually noticed that she would always seem kind of isolated and withdrawn. So this teacher reached out to her, found out that Liliana could speak Spanish, so brought in a janitor who spoke Spanish. So the janitor would communicate with her. And so eventually, over time, over the 2-year period, the school teacher, the janitor, the gardener that was her friend, all these different folks that became her friends, another family member would make friends with her and talk with her, even though she was told you are not to talk to anybody. And so when she was ready to leave her abusive conditions, it was like the movies, like literally, if you look at like the court records and everything, they literally like organized it. They put her in, they scheduled the day. They had her go in the back of one of their cars, put a blanket over her. So there's photos like of documenting it so they could show it to police. Of her different journey, of different points of journey. So she's in the back of the car, they're all helping her, and she leaves. They take her to law enforcement so she could report what was happening. She asked for her identification. She saw a banner of La Raza Centro Legal, which was an organization saying they worked with trafficked people, and she reached out to them. And so sometimes people will see the outreach by organizations, sometimes they don't. A lot of the nonprofits that do the on-the-ground work don't have the resources to make themselves visible. And so it does then require, I think, even in our own community, to know who are those organizations that we should know about, that we should support, that could be helping another person's life. And so I guess that's a long answer to your very great question, is if you do learn that somebody may be experiencing trafficking, I think I would also say that you are not law enforcement, unless if you literally are. Your job is not to investigate it and figure out everything, because you could impact your own safety. And also, maybe it's not trafficking. Maybe it's domestic violence. Maybe it is a labor violation. And so you don't want to assume that you know the whole thing and know the facets of the resources that a person needs. So just share with them all and let them have the power to determine and the agency to determine what is the best resources that they need. When I used to work a lot with trafficked people, I found that they were experiencing a lot of things, but the thing that was oftentimes most important to them was housing and work. Those are the things that they were looking for. And that the experience of abuse was something else that they had experienced that they didn't always want to talk about.
A very, very quick final question.
Mm-hmm.
No? Okay. Then please join me again, thanking a lot for being here and sharing this work with us. We really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.